On a damp spring evening, the river behind her house ran high, and an old widow sat on her back porch, watching a wild bobcat climb the pillar beneath the bridge. Each night, the cat claimed the same narrow ledge above the dark water and stayed while the current slapped at the stone. The widow tried to forget what this river could do, yet the rising water brought sirens and red lights into her chest as she pulled her blanket close and followed the bobcat's steady stare. Slowly she saw the truth. The mother was not resting at all. The cat was guarding something tucked in a crack of stone, something she would not abandon as the water crept higher. And one question waited in the dark. The river behind my house never quite goes silent, even on still evenings. When the last truck has rolled off the old bridge and the diner sign clicks dark across the road, there is always a faint shuffle, a soft scrape, a ripple where no wind seems to move. Lately, those sounds have started coming at the same hour. Most nights, I sit in my warm porch chair with the blanket tucked around my knees, listening to the fridge hum behind me and the faint whistle of a train miles away. The porch boards give a tiny creak under my weight, then settle. When the clock over my kitchen sink reaches 8, something shifts out by the middle pillar beneath the bridge, and the hairs along my arms rise for no good reason. At first, I blamed the house. Old places remember every step you've ever taken in them. They stretch and sigh in the cool. Joints crack. Pipes murmur. The soft thud against the railing. The almost delicate tap on the boards near the far corner could be nothing but wood remembering a younger woman pacing there. That was the story I told myself. But the marks did not feel like memory. One morning, frost laced the railing in silver. I wrapped my robe tighter and stepped out, breath a pale cloud. On the rail near the stairs, the crystals were smudged in a rounded pattern, as if something small had paused there, pressed down, then leapt away toward the yard. I brushed the spot with my fingers and felt a faint, damp warmth still clinging to the wood. That day, the river looked ordinary enough. Lights slid down the concrete supports under the bridge, making long grey shadows that reached toward my property line. A grocery sack had snagged on a snagged branch, fluttering like a tired flag. Yet when I glanced back from the kitchen window, I had the odd sensation someone out there was already watching me, steady and patient, just beyond what my aging eyes could pin down. The sounds continued. A light bump beneath the porch, like something brushing past a beam. A soft slide on the gravel near the back steps. Then silence when I held my breath to listen. Once, lying awake in my bedroom, I heard the faintest puff of air right under the open window, as if a lungful of night had been exhaled carefully, testing the scent of the house before moving on. I told myself it was wind, or raccoons, or my own mind looping on itself. Retirement leaves a lot of empty hours for that. The doctor called it heightened body awareness, which is a polite way of saying an old woman notices every hitch in her breath and flutter in her chest. Still, when the skin along the back of my neck prickled for no clear reason, I found myself checking the locks twice before bed. The pattern settled in. As the church bell 2 streets over rang 8 muffled tones, something shifted near the river. A shadow slipped from one dark patch to another beneath the bridge. The porch rail thudded once, not loud, but firm enough to make the mug in my hand tremble. I could almost feel an intent in the air, as if whatever moved out there was not wandering, but keeping time. One evening, a low scrape ran along the underside of the porch like a careful claw on old wood, and my heart gave a sharp, foolish leap. I stood very still, feeling the drum of my pulse in my throat, the cool air pressing against my cheeks. The sound stopped immediately, as if the thing beneath me was listening, too, waiting to see what I would do. Nothing in the yard moved, yet the feeling of not being alone sat heavy in my chest. The next night, I brought a flashlight out with me, though I told myself I just needed to check the rain barrel. When 8 o'clock crept close, the familiar hush fell over the road, and the river's usual murmur shifted into something tighter, more focused. A soft plunk came from the direction of the centre pillar, like a wet stone being laid rather than thrown. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, knuckles aching. I aimed the beam toward the water, sweeping past the reeds, the low bank, the first concrete support. The light bounced off ripples and caught on driftwood before snagging on the middle pillar. For a split second, I saw a compact shape outlined there, high above the waterline, still as carved stone. Ears pricked toward me. The beam hit its eyes, and they flashed briefly, startlingly bright, before the shape slipped down out of the light. The flashlight clattered from my hand onto the boards, bouncing once before, rolling to a stop against my slipper. All at once, I was aware of my breathing, too fast and too loud, and the cold edge of the porch rail under my palms. The night beyond the circle of the fallen light felt dense, aware, holding a single quiet breath of its own. I told myself it was nothing dangerous, probably just one of the usual river wanderers, drawn by the smell of leftovers from the diner's dumpster, using the pillar as a stepping stone. I repeated that thought as I picked up the flashlight, as I shuffled back inside, as I locked the door. Even so, when 8 o'clock came and went the following evening, and the single thud on the railing sounded right on time, I knew in my bones that something out there had chosen this place, and that it was not wandering at all. The river, the house, the narrow strip of yard between them Someone else was using them now. Same hour, same path, as if keeping watch. The realization settled over me like a weight. Whatever moved beneath the bridge was not passing through. It had begun to stay. And I lay awake that night with the uneasy certainty that sooner or later I would have to step closer and see what exactly was sharing my dark. The following week, the pattern sharpened. By then I had stopped pretending not to notice. Each evening, I made a show of rinsing my mug and straightening the dish towel, but my attention stretched thin toward the back door, toward the strip of river just beyond the fence. 8 o'clock was no longer just a time of day. It was an appointment. I tried to ignore it. I turned the radio on, let the oldies station blur into the background, stirred soup that didn't need stirring. Yet when the church bell tolls drifted faintly through the window, my hands stilled on the spoon. A soft tap answered from the porch rail, gentle but precise, followed by a faint scuff on the steps. That deliberate timing made the skin on my arms pebble with chill. The next morning, frost returned, glittering on the porch boards and along the top of the fence. I stepped outside with my robe belted tight, breath puffing in short clouds. On the rail, where that tap had sounded, the frost bore a series of distinct impressions. Small, oval marks paired side by side, leading toward the yard. They were too neat for a raccoon, too round for a bird. Something with padded feet had paused there, looking in, down by the river. The silt along the edge told a similar story. Four-toed prints marked the damp sand near the centre line between my yard and the bridge, appearing and vanishing among the reed stems. I crouched slowly, joints protesting, and touched the edge of one. It was fresh, the edges still crisp, the shallow centre still moist with river damp. Whatever had left, it had passed by not long before dawn. That evening, I left the porch light off. The house behind me felt like a warm bubble, a hum of appliances. The faint tick of the wall clock, but I stayed outside, wrapped in my blanket, watching the dark. The bridge loomed against the sky, its underbelly a deep, matte shadow. Out by the middle pillar, the river thickened into a darker stripe where the current pulled. When the 8th bell sounded in the distance, I heard it, the soft pad of paws on wood, then a light jump onto the rail. The boards quivered under the added weight. I kept perfectly still, eyes forward, sensing a presence just at the edge of my vision. A warm, wild scent reached me, earth, dry grass, something faintly metallic and unfamiliar. My heartbeat tapped along in my ears. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a compact body standing on the rail, balanced with ease. Short tail, tufted ears, shoulders rolling gently as it shifted weight to peer toward the river. I did not move, afraid to break whatever fragile truce allowed it to stand so near me. After a breath, it stepped down soundlessly and slipped along the edge of the yard, heading straight for the water. I turned only when it reached the fence. There, at the narrow opening where the boards never quite met, it paused and looked back. In the ambient glow from the bridge lamps, I saw spots mottling its coat, a pale chin, eyes that held no panic, only calculation. A bobcat, full grown and lithe, stood in my fence line as if it owned the place and I were the guest. It passed through the gap and vanished into the reeds, its passage marked only by a faint rustle and a moving stripe of darkness. I walked slowly to the fence, fingers brushing the rough top rail. The air, where it had stood still, held that wild scent, threaded with a hint of milk and damp stone. I realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, exactly, but from the sudden sense that my quiet life had been watched for some time. A minute later, I saw her again. She had climbed the center pillar, claws finding some invisible ladder along the concrete. Halfway up, she paused, then continued to a narrow ledge near the top, where the water could never reach. There she settled, front paws braced, body angled just so, facing my yard and the sweep of the current below. From that vantage point, she could see everything. Why here? Why this pillar? This stretch of river? This tired little house with its aging widow and sagging porch? I leaned against the fence, breathing in the cold, and felt the ache of an old question in my chest. Years ago, I had asked the same thing, standing not far from here in the rain, watching red lights paint the water. Why this car? This turn in the road? This family? Why must I witness this and be able to do so little? The bobcat did not move. She held her post on the concrete like a soldier on a wall, her silhouette cutting a small, resolute notch out of the night. The river lapped softly at the pillar's base, and a breeze riffled the fur along her shoulders. When the distant train horn sounded, she flicked an ear, then settled deeper, as if resigning herself to a long watch. I stayed with her until my feet went numb and my hip began to throb. Finally, I turned toward the house, pausing once to look back. The pillar remained crowned by that small, steadfast shape. She did not look at me. Her gaze was fixed on some point lower down, just out of my sight. As I shut the door behind me, one thought followed me in, unsettling and persistent. Whatever had chosen my river and my yard was not wandering at all. She was guarding something, and I had no idea what. Long before she climbed my pillar, the bobcat learned the value of edges. She drew near to things without quite belonging, moving along fence lines, ditches, and the thin strip where woods give way to fields. In those in-between spaces, she could watch both worlds and commit to neither, ready to vanish the moment one grew too loud. She came into this valley during a dry autumn, when the leaves crunched under her small feet and mice ran bold across cracked stream beds. The place she had been born, a rocky cut near a quarry road, had grown noisy with blasting and diesel fumes. One night, the ground trembled under her family's den, and a sheet of stone sheared away with a roar. By dawn, only she and her mother remained among the scattered dust and broken ledges. They moved then, not far, but often. A hay shed one week, all prickly bales and the faint sweetness of stored clover. The gap beneath a porch the next, where warm air breathed out from a vent and human laughter boomed overhead. Each place offered shelter, and each carried risk. Dogs that barked too sharply, doors that slammed without warning, headlights that swept across the yard like searching eyes. She watched humans from shadow. In one yard, a man in coveralls left a bowl of something fragrant near the back step. Her mother accepted it once, eating in hurried gulps. Then never again. They slipped past the house for several nights afterward, moving like smoke along the hedge, while the bowl sat untouched, rim collecting leaves. Trust, the bobcat learned, could fill your belly and mark you at the same time. When winter came, snow stitched a bright thread along every trail. The bobcat's paws burned with cold as she padded after her mother's deeper prints. They followed the river, keeping to the fringe of trees where branches bent low with ice. The water itself steamed faintly in the cold air, making the world smell clean and sharp. Occasionally, the older female glanced toward the current with something wary in her gaze. One dawn, the younger bobcat woke to find the world muffled and grey. Heavy snow had fallen in the night, burying the underbrush. The hollow they had sheltered in was filling with drifting flake. Her mother nudged her hard, pushing her out. Together they slogged toward higher ground, but the slope was slick, the footing treacherous. At the base of a low bank, the younger one slipped, sliding toward a shallow pool half hidden under slush. The water was not deep, barely past her knees, but the shock of it stole her breath. For a moment she flailed, ice biting through fur, until a firm grip closed on the loose skin at her neck and hauled her clear. Her mother dragged her onto a fallen log and held her there, licking vigorously until feeling returned. Above them, the river murmured on, indifferent, but a new wariness settled into the younger bobcat's bones. Low places near water could change shape in a single night. After that, whenever dark clouds gathered over the ridge, her mother steered them toward mounds, rocks, abandoned piles of timber, anything that stood above the surrounding land. High spots became more than vantage points. They were promises, quiet assurances that rising water would not reach them there. The younger bobcat began to seek them on her own, testing ledges, clambering onto old stumps, learning how much height made her lungs finally loosen. In spring, they passed a small town tucked against the valley floor. Smoke lifted from chimneys in soft blue ribbons. A narrow road crossed the river on a bridge held up by concrete pillars, each one standing like a grey tree trunk in the current. From the tangle of willows nearby, the bobcat watched cars trundle over, tyres making a steady hum. At night, lights glowed under the bridge, painting pale paths along the water. Here, the edges were plentiful. Backyards ended in wild tangles. Barns leaned toward open fields. The river split the town from the woods like a drawn line. The bobcat found herself circling these borders, drawn to the smells that gathered there. Cooking, gasoline, whetstone, and the musk of other creatures who lived on scraps and courage. It was a map written in scent, and she traced it with care. One summer storm changed the map. Rain hammered the valley for 2 days straight, drumming on roofs and pounding the river into a churning, brown rope. From a low hollow near a culvert, the bobcat watched the water climb. The spot had seemed safe when it was dry, tucked, quiet, threaded with roots. But as the ground softened under her stomach and small streams began to cut new paths, dread spread through her like cold. By nightfall, the hollow was a bowl-catching runoff. Water seeped across the floor, then trickled, then ran faster. The bobcat climbed higher onto the roots, claws slipping in the mud. Thunder growled over the valley, making her ears flatten. When a sheet of earth finally slumped away, taking part of the den with it, she scrambled out, scrambling toward the nearest rise, lungs burning, heart beating a panicked drum. She did not forget how quickly safety had turned to danger. In the days that followed, she paced the banks long after the river shrank back into its bed, studying where debris had caught and where the waterline had licked at trunks and stones. Some spots, she saw, remained untouched, even at the flood's peak. The tops of thick roots, the stumps of old fence posts, and the narrow ledges on the concrete pillars beneath the bridge. The memory lodged itself in her like a seed. As seasons turned, she grew leaner, stronger, the awkwardness of youth melting into a fluid stride. she hunted along field edges, kept to the shadows when headlights swept past, and chose her resting places with increasing precision. High, dry, with a view of both the open ground and the paths that led toward it. That was where she slept best. She did not trust low hollows anymore. No matter how soft the moss or how warm the air. When she first scented milk on her own body, subtle but undeniable, those old lessons rose up all at once. The world would not merely be a place to survive now. It would be something she must shield. As she moved along the river in search of a den, pausing to test old logs and root tangles, her gaze kept returning to the bridge supports, to that one narrow shelf of concrete that had stood dry even when the valley roared. Instinct and memory braided together, drawing her back toward the pillar that rose from the restless water. Back in the present, the valley settled into a damp, hesitant spring. Patches of snow clung to the north sides of things, but the river ran clearer, carrying twigs and last year's leaves. My evenings took on a new shape. I still made simple suppers and listened to the radio, but my mind was always half turned toward the yard, waiting to see if my quiet sentinel would appear. One afternoon, I found myself at the diner, stirring cream into my coffee long after it had cooled. At the next booth, 2 men from the volunteer fire department were talking about the river level and the schedule for releasing water from the dam upstream. I knew their faces from years ago, when I still rode in the truck instead of watching it pass my window. Hearing their voices made something in my chest tighten and then loosen, like an old knot pulled gently free. "You still out by the bridge, Mrs. Cole?" one of them asked as they stood to go. His tone held nothing but neighbourly warmth. "We've seen prints down that way. You be careful at dusk." I nodded and gave some light answer, but inside I felt the overlapping worlds, their bright jackets on rainy nights, my porch light marking my little patch, and the wild gaze it's seen on the pillar pressing toward each other. That evening, I did something I hadn't yet dared. I carried a shallow dish of water and set it near the fence gap, not close enough to the house to feel like a trap, but not so far that I couldn't see it from my chair. Beside it, on a flat stone, I laid a small scrap of leftover roast, more out of curiosity than charity. The act felt like sliding an envelope under a stranger's door without knowing if they could read. As 8 approached, the air cooled, brushing my cheeks with a damp touch. The church bell chimed its familiar count. I heard the porch boards creak with a new weight. Then that soft, deliberate step along the rail. The scent of wild grass and earth reached me a heartbeat before a shadow moved toward the fence. I watched, forcing myself to stay still, every nerve stretched thin. She appeared at the gap, head low, ears forward. The lantern glow from my window edged her whiskers in gold and picked out the pale spots along her flanks. She glanced at the water dish first, nostrils flaring, then at the meat. Instead of rushing to eat, she lifted her head and looked directly at me. The gaze was not pleading or grateful. It was measuring, as if assessing what kind of creature would leave such offerings and what they might want in return. Slowly, she stepped forward. One paw touched the ground beside the dish. Not in it. She sniffed the roast, then turned away from it, eyes drifting toward the river. With a flex of muscle, she squeezed through the gap and padded down the narrow path to the bank. My gift remained untouched, glistening faintly on the stone. It felt less like rejection than correction, a quiet reminder that I did not yet understand the conversation she was trying to have. I followed at a distance, my slippers whispering against the grass. At the water's edge, she stopped and lowered herself into a crouch, muscles quivering under her coat. Her gaze was locked on the pillar, on that same narrow ledge halfway up. After a few heartbeats, she rose and paced along the shore, circling the base of the support with restless steps. Every so often, she glanced back toward my fence, as if making sure I was, in fact, watching. Then she did something that made my breath catch. She stepped onto a flat stone near the base of the pillar, picked up a small object in her mouth, a bit of river-worn wood, smooth and pale, and carried it to the edge of my yard. There, just inside the line where the wild grass met my mowed lawn, she dropped it with care. She sat beside it for a moment, pulse visible in her throat, then turned and padded away, disappearing into the reeds without looking back. I approached the little piece of driftwood as if it might vanish if I moved too quickly. It was about the length of my hand, dry despite the damp ground. Its surface rubbed satin smooth by time and current. A single dark line ran through it, like the faint memory of a crack. I picked it up and felt a strange conviction, as if I were holding not just a random bit of debris, but a marker placed with intent. Here. Look here. Pay attention to this edge. That night, sleep came in fits. I dreamed of standing on the bridge in my reflective coat again, watching water lick higher at the pillars while radios crackled at my shoulder. Only this time, when I looked down, I saw not flashing lights on wet pavement, but the small, steady form of a bobcat on the concrete ledge. Eyes turned up toward me. I woke with my heart pounding, the impression of her gaze lingering like a question pressed into my ribs. The following evening, I left the dish of water where it had been and added nothing else. Instead, I carried the driftwood back to the river and laid it on the flat stone beside the pillar's base. The gesture felt foolish and solemn at once, like returning a message to its source. Then I stepped back and took my seat on the porch, waiting to see if my answer would be acknowledged. She came, right on time. I heard the soft jolt of her landing on the rail, the faint thump as she dropped to the yard, the rustle of her passing through the gap. This time, when she reached the flat stone and saw the wood replaced there, she paused longer. Her tail tip twitched once. She looked from the stone to my porch and back again, then tipped her head in a small, almost imperceptible nod before scaling the pillar in a smooth, practiced climb. As she settled on the ledge, the last light drained from the sky, leaving us both in shades of grey and shadow. Yet there was a new thread running between us now, invisible but undeniable. I had returned what she brought. I had acknowledged the place she'd chosen. And while I still had no idea what exactly, she was trying to shield out there above the water, I understood this much. We were no longer ignoring each other. Our lives had begun to lean, gently, toward the same piece of river. The forecast turned sour in early May. One low, brooding front settled over the valley. Then another queued up behind it, each promising more rain than the last. Folks at the diner talked about sump pumps and wet basements, and the men from the fire department checked their boats and ropes with the brisk focus I remembered too well. The air itself felt swollen, waiting. At home, the river began to climb, almost politely at first. The water darkened, its surface smoothing over stones that usually poked through like knuckles. Bits of bark and trash snagged higher along the bank each day. I watched from the porch, fingers wrapped around my mug, feeling an old, unwelcome tightness gather under my breastbone. The last time I had seen the river like this, it had taken more than fence posts. On those evenings, the Bobcat's behaviour changed. She still came at 8, still touched the rail with that light, claiming jump, but her movements were sharper, her pauses shorter. Instead of simply climbing the pillar and settling, she circled the base first, pacing a restless loop that left the mud crisscrossed with tracks. Her ears flicked constantly, catching sounds I could not hear. She glanced up at the cloud-heavy sky, then toward my yard, over and over, as if triangulating some invisible threat. I found myself talking to her under my breath, the way I used to murmur to frightened passengers strapped into stretchers. "It's all right," it'd say, even when it wasn't, because sometimes the tone mattered more than the facts. "We're watching it," I whispered now, eyes on the riverline. "Well, see what it does." The words were meant for both of us. My own heart gave a small, answering flutter at the lie. 2 days into the rain, the dam release notice came over the radio. It was routine, the announcer said, just making room for what was coming, but the tightness in my chest ratcheted up. I knew what that meant for the supports under the bridge, for that narrow ledge halfway up. The water would swell, roiling and thick, and the comfort of its never reached that high before would thin out into guesswork. That afternoon, I drove to the station for the first time in years. The walls still smelled faintly of coffee and drying gear. Old photos lined the hallway. Parades, pancake breakfasts, wet, muddy figures grinning after long nights. My own face appeared in several of them, younger and more certain, standing shoulder to shoulder with people who still moved like a single organism when trouble came. "Thought that was your car," Captain Harris said when he saw me. His hair had gone more silver, his shoulders a little rounder, but his eyes were the same, steady blue. "You finally decide you've had enough peace and quiet." His attempt at lightness couldn't mask the concern underneath. Had been there the night water and bad luck took a driver off the low road. The night I went home and didn't come back. "I've got something on my stretch of river," I said, surprising myself with how quickly the words came. "A bobcat. Female. She's using the center pillar as a perch. And she's not leaving." I told him about the driftwood, the timing, the way she now paced when the rain grew heavier. As I spoke, I saw the call in his eyes, responsibility stitching itself to the situation, turning my private unease into shared duty. "Well, keep an eye on it," he said. "If the level looks like it'll push past safe, we can try to move her, or at least keep people back. Last thing we need is anyone trying to play hero with a wild animal in high water." He didn't say, out loud, what we both remembered. The night Wed tried to reach a trapped car and misjudged how quickly the current would undercut the bank. Sometimes, even with all the right gear, you arrived just half a minute too late, driving home in the rain, wipers beating time. I felt old ghosts climbing into the car with me. The radio crackled softly with weather updates, but underneath it, I heard echoes of past calls, of frantic voices on the scanner, of my own younger voice saying, "We're on our way." I tightened my grip on the wheel until my fingers ached. I had built a life around not hearing those sounds anymore. And now here I was, inviting them back in because a silent animal had chosen my pillar. That night, the river was louder than the road. Water slapped against the supports with a hollow, insistent rhythm. The air tasted metallic, like pennies on the tongue. The bobcat arrived soaked, fur darkened and clinging to her ribs, but she moved with the same sure purpose. She scaled the pillar, shook once, and planted herself in her usual spot, body tensed as if ready to spring at something only she could sense. For the first time, I saw her hesitate. She peered down toward some hidden point on the pillar's face, muscles rippling. Then she looked up at my porch, eyes catching the light just enough for me to see the question in them. It wasn't quite fear, but it was close. A calculation about whether this place, this height, would hold against whatever was coming. My chest squeezed at the familiarity of that expression. I'd seen it in parents' faces on the roadside, in my own reflection after long shifts. Inside the house, the phone sat on its cradle, a quiet weight. With every slap of water against concrete, with every restless shift of the bobcat's paws, the choice grew heavier. I could pretend not to see, let nature play its hand, tell myself I'd stayed out of it. Or I could pick up the receiver, call the station, and step back into a world where outcomes were uncertain, but effort was mandatory. The fear of failing again battled the shame of doing nothing at all. In the end, my hand moved almost on its own. I lifted the phone, dialed the familiar number, and listened to the line ring. As I waited for someone to answer, I watched the small figure on the pillar, her body framing some point I could not yet see. "It's me," I said when the click came. "It's about the river, and about what she's guarding out there." The words hung in the air between the three of us. The man on the line, the woman on the porch, and the wild mother poised above rising water, all tangled now in the same choice. They came without sirens, just as Harris had promised. 2 trucks with modest light bars rolled to a stop on the gravel pull-off near my house, engines ticking as they cooled. The rain had eased to a fine mist that beaded on jackets and hair, making everything shimmer in the bridge's sodium glow. The river, swollen but not yet roaring, slid by with a quiet, inexorable insistence. I met them at the fence. Boots sank slightly into the soft ground, leaving prints alongside the bobcat's tracks. The men moved with practiced calm, voices low, glancing often at the waterline on the supports. A small aluminum boat rode on its trailer behind one truck, its metal sides glistening. It looked much like the one Wed used years ago, back when I still pulled a life vest over my own shoulders instead of watching from porches. "She's up there," I said, nodding toward the center pillar. Right on cue, the bobcat appeared at the gap, slipping through as if she owned the place. She spared the trucks a brief, measuring glance, then trotted down to the riverbank with her body held low. Her fur lay flat, but every line of her spoke of tension. She did not flee. She went straight to the base of the pillar, as if to confirm that whatever she guarded was still in place. One of the younger volunteers raised a hand, starting to point. "Easy," I murmured, instinctively. No sudden movements, She's not lost. She's working. The word surprised me, but it felt right. Harris gave a small, acknowledging grunt and signalled for the men to slow their pace even further. They unhooked the boat with the careful efficiency of long practice, muscles remembering what their minds no longer had to think through. As they slid the boat into the water, the Bobcat began to climb. Her claws scraped softly against the damp concrete, each movement precise. Halfway up, she pressed herself close to the pillar, making her body a partial shield. She glanced back once toward us on the shore, eyes catching the light. I felt, absurdly, as if she were counting us, weighing whether we might be allies or simply another threat she'd have to account for. The boat pushed off with a hollow scrape, carrying 3 figures. Harris at the stern, another man at the bow, and a third in the middle with a long-handled net and a thick blanket. As they drew closer, the Bobcat's ears flattened briefly. She hunkered lower, chin nearly touching the ledge. For a moment, I feared she might leap and vanish into the night, leaving whatever she guarded to the mercy of the water. Instead, she stayed, body vibrating with tension. When the boat eased within a few yards of the pillar, the third man lifted a flashlight and aimed its beam carefully, keeping it low to avoid blinding her. The light traced along the concrete, past streaks of old waterlines and moss, until it pooled under the Bobcat's body. There, in the slight hollow her frame concealed, something small shifted a faint, trembling movement against the stone. It's not just her. Harris called softly over the water. There's a little one tucked in there. His voice, even across the distance, held a mix of wonder and concern. She found herself a shelf above the high line and stashed the kit in a crack. Smart girl. He kept his tone low and even, the way Wed always been taught to speak around fear, whether human or otherwise. From the shore, I could just make it out. A tiny shape pressed against the pillar, fur damp but not soaked, eyes still cloudy with youth. Bits of dried grass and shredded foam, probably scavenged from some discarded life vest or river trash, formed a makeshift nest around it. The Bobcat had positioned her body as a living barricade, taking the brunt of the mist and wind while the kit huddled in the lee of her ribs. Something in my chest cracked open at the sight. Years ago, I had stood on this same stretch of riverbank and watched a car nose slowly deeper into rising water, its headlights dimming. Wed arrived with ropes and determination, but too little time. The memory of that sinking shape had lodged in me like a shard, a testament to all the things vigilance couldn't prevent. Now, here was a different image. A mother who had read the valley signs as well as any map, who had chosen a high, narrow shelf because she remembered what floods could do. The men in the boat conferred in low tones. There was no dramatic shouting, no flurry of orders, just a quiet, careful plan taking shape. They would try to lift the kit first, swaddling it in the blanket, then give the bobcat a chance to follow. If she panicked, they'd back off. No one was eager to tangle with sharp claws on unstable footing, and no one wanted to break the fragile line of trust that had brought us all here. Talk to her. Harris called to me, like you used to with the passengers. Soft, steady. Let her know we're not here to take everything away. The request startled me, but my body answered before my mind could argue. I stepped closer to the water, rain beading on my coat, and let my voice find its old, work-worn cadence. You've done well, I said, not caring how foolish I might sound to the men or the river. You picked a good spot. We see what you've been watching. We're just here to help move the little one somewhere even safer. That's all. My words floated across the water, simple and earnest. The bobcat's ears flicked once. She did not relax, but she did not lash out when the boat edged closer. Slowly, carefully, the man with the blanket reached up. His fingers trembled just enough for me to see, though his movements stayed controlled. He slid his hands under the kit, scooping it into the thick fabric and wrapping it snug. For a heartbeat, the bobcat tensed, claws biting into concrete, a small, warning growl curling from her throat. Then, as the bundle came free, she shifted her weight, following it with her gaze rather than her teeth. The boat rocked gently as the weight of the kit settled into the middle. The little body wriggled weakly, a tiny sound escaping its muzzle. The bobcat let out a short, answering call, half reassurance, half command, and then, in a move that took my breath, she leapt. She landed on the boat's bow, claws scraping for purchase, tail lashing once before she crouched low, eyes locked on the bundle in the blanket. No one in the boat moved faster than necessary. They simply let her be, a watchful presence inches from their boots. On the shore, my legs felt suddenly unsteady. I remembered another night, another small form lifted from danger, and the heavy silence that had followed despite all our efforts. This time, the silence felt different. It was full of held breath, of possibility. As the boat angled toward a rocky outcrop, a little upstream high ground chosen for a temporary den, I felt something in me step off an invisible ledge. The story written on this piece of river would not end the way the last one had. By the time they reached the rocks, the kit had quieted, lulled by the motion and the warmth of the blanket. The men set the bundle down, then stepped back. The bobcat followed, leaping lightly from the bow, She nosed the edge of the fabric, then worked her head under it, tugging until her young one wriggled free and pressed against her belly. Satisfied, she turned once to look back downriver toward the pillar, the house, and, improbably, toward me. In that look, I felt a strange, mutual recognition. She had trusted the height, the ledge, her own memory of where water had once reached. I had trusted old skills and old colleagues enough to pick up the phone again. Between us lay a small bundle of damp fur and the shared awareness that watching alone, no matter how faithfully, is sometimes not enough. The men packed up with the same quiet they'd arrived with. No one slapped backs or crowed. They just nodded to me, coiling ropes and stowing gear. As the trucks pulled away, their tail lights shrinking on the wet road, I stood by the fence and listened to the river's new tone. Lower now, as the dam release eased. On the rocky rise, the bobcat curled herself around her kit, a living barricade on higher ground. For the first time in many years, the tightness in my chest loosened not because I'd turned away from the hard things, but because I'd met one head on and found, to my surprise, that I could still help carry it. The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow, grateful exhale. The rain passed. The river slipped back into its usual channel, and the town returned to its ordinary concerns. Lawns to mow, potholes to dodge, gossip to exchange over pie at the diner. Yet for me, and for a certain wild mother on the far bank, nothing was quite the same again. A new line had been drawn across the map of our days. The bobcat did not abandon the pillar. She visited it still, especially at dusk, padding down from the rocky outcrop where Wed relocated her nest. Her kit, growing sturdier by the day, sometimes followed part way, then sat on a lower rock, watching as she made the familiar climb. From my porch, I could track their movements by the shift of shadow on stone, by the faint, questioning chirps that drifted over the water. Our shared ritual deepened. At 8 o'clock, I took my seat with a blanket and a mug, listening for the soft thud on the rail that announced her passing. Some evenings, she touched it, more out of habit than necessity, before slipping through the fence gap. Other nights, she bypassed the porch entirely, heading straight down the narrow path, confident that I would be in my place even if she did not check. There was a comfort in that mutual assumption. The kit grew bolder as summer warmed the valley. On still mornings, I would wake to find small, scattered tracks in the damp earth near the edge of the yard. The impressions lighter and closer together than the mother's. Once, looking up from my crossword at the kitchen table, I caught a glimpse of a smaller, spotted body perched briefly on the very rail where she had once stood alone. Its balance wobbled, but its gaze was steady, turned toward the pillar as if studying the route it would one day climb. Word spread in the quiet way it does in small towns. A few fishermen whispered about the little family by the bridge, lowering their voices in the diner out of respect, not secrecy. The fire department added a line to their informal checklists. Swing by, Mrs. Coles, stretch. Make sure folks weren't crowding the banks. No one put up signs or posted photos online. It felt less like a spectacle and more like a shared secret. A bit of living courage the valley had been trusted to hold gently. Seasons began to turn in larger circles around us. In late summer, fireflies stitched slow constellations over the yard, their brief flares reflecting on the water below. The bobcat and her young one moved through that flickering field like small, dark comets, barely disturbing the air. On dry, crinkling autumn nights, leaves skittered along the porch boards, and the crisp scent of wood smoke twined with the clean musk of their passing. Inside my house, changes took root as quietly as moss. I started stopping by the station more often. At first, just to drop off cookies or ask after friends, then to sit in on a training night now and then. I didn't go back to riding in the truck. Some doors, once closed, stay that way for good reasons. But I found I could listen to radio traffic without flinching, could offer calm words over the phone when a nervous caller described smoke or rising water. The part of me that had once belonged wholly to emergencies learned a new, gentler rhythm. The bridge itself seemed to accept our shared history. Cracks in the concrete were patched, railings repainted, but the centre pillar bore faint lines where floodwaters had kissed it. A quiet record of past surges. I learned to read those marks the way the bobcat did, tracing with my eyes where debris had lodged and where the high line had stopped. Each evening, when she took her place on the ledge, I felt less dread and more kinship. We were both, in our own ways, keeping watch over the same fragile balance. Winter came round again, soft at first, then in earnest. Snow softened the edges of everything, draping the rocks and reeds in muffled white. The river narrowed, dark against the pale banks. On the coldest nights, my breath plumed into the air alongside the faint steam rising from the bobcat's fur as they stood together on the higher rocks. The kit, now nearly as big as its mother, attempted the pillar climb for the first time under my watchful eye. It slipped once, caught itself, then reached the ledge and settled right beside her. Both pairs of eyes turned toward my porch. I raised my mug in a reflexive little salute, smiling despite the numbness in my fingers. Two shapes on the pillar now, not one. a legacy written in muscle and memory rather than ink. They had learned from each other, just as I had learned from them, to choose height without abandoning ground, to accept help without surrendering wildness, to keep loving a place even after it had shown you its dangerous moods. In spring, children I knew only in passing, grandchildren of neighbours, most likely began to draw chalk pictures on the sidewalk near the diner. A bridge, a river, two small, pointy-eared figures on a block in the middle. Bridge cats, one woman explained with a fond roll of her eyes. They've become local mascots. I smiled, but said nothing, holding the deeper, truer story behind my ribs like a warm stone. Through it all, our evening appointment remained. 8 o'clock. The soft creak of boards, the sense of another heartbeat layered gently over my own. On nights when the valley lay especially still, I could hear the faint scuff of paws on concrete as they shifted on the ledge, matching it with the old, familiar thrum of my pulse. The river kept moving, as it always would, but the three of us women, mother, grown young, had woven our separate paths into a single, quiet vigil. Years have a way of sliding by when each day carries a small, steady ritual. The bridge has seen fresh coats of paint and a few new cracks since that first stormy night. My hair has thinned and gone white as river foam. The porch chair creaks louder when I lower myself into it. Yet some things remain so constant that they anchor you more firmly than any railing. For me, that anchor is still the sight of small, spotted shapes against concrete and sky. The bobcat mother moves more slowly now. Her shoulders, once rolling with youthful power, bear a slight stiffness when she climbs. She chooses the pillar less often, favouring the higher rocks where the path is kinder. Her grown offspring sleek, strong, unmistakably hers, has taken to the ledge instead, testing angles of view, shifting weight with an authority learned from years of watching. The guard has not been dismissed. It has simply changed posts. On certain evenings, when the light goes particularly honey gold before it fades, I see them together. Mother on the rock, young one on the pillar, both facing the same sweep of river and yard. From my porch, wrapped in the same wool blanket if mended a dozen times, I feel the years between us fall away. We are three creatures who have outlived storms we once thought might break us, each still returning, by choice, to the place where fear and courage first locked eyes. Inside my house, small tokens of that first rescue have claimed quiet corners. On the kitchen windowsill rests the piece of driftwood she once carried to my lawn, its surface polished smooth by my absent-minded thumb. Beside it sits a stone the size of a walnut, picked up from the rocky outcrop the morning after the kit's relocation. Together, they mark a before and after no calendar could fully capture. I still answer the phone for the station some nights, when thunderheads roll over the ridge or icy rain slicks the roads. My voice has grown softer with age, but it carries a steadier note now. I know, more intimately than I once did, that not every story will end the way you hope. Yet I also know that stepping forward, even when your heart hammers and your memories protest, can tilt the balance in quiet, profound ways. A wild mother taught me that without speaking a word. The town has embraced its bridge guardians in its own gentle fashion. There's a small sketch tacked to the bulletin board at the diner, a pencil rendering of the pillar with two pointed silhouettes on top, signed by someone's teenage grandchild. On festival days, you hear people say, "Hope the river neighbours are doing all right today," with the same tone they use for absent family. No one tries to get too close. Admiration keeps a respectful distance. On the evening I'm thinking of now, the sky blushes a soft peach before easing into blue-grey. A low breeze carries the smell of damp earth and distant frying onions from the diner. I settle into my chair at the familiar hour, blanket over my knees, mug warm in my hands. The boards beneath me groan in the old, companionable way. The church bell marks 8, each note landing lightly on the air. Right on cue, a movement catches my eye. The younger Bobcat, though she is not truly young anymore, steps from the shadow of the rocks, body fluid and sure. She pauses at the edge of the yard, nose lifting to taste the air that spills from my open kitchen window. Behind her, on the highest stone, the older female settles carefully, tail curling around her paws, gaze tracking the climb. The ritual is in good hands. Or pause. Now, I watch as the ledge is claimed once more. Paws find the familiar footholds in the pillar's rough face. A single leap carries her to the narrow shelf. She turns, settles, and, after a moment, looks directly toward my porch. The distance between us is filled with the river's steady murmur, with the layered history of storms weathered and fears faced. I lift my mug the smallest bit in greeting. There is no dramatic swell of music, no thunderclap of realization, just a quiet, deep warmth spreading through my chest as I sit there, feeling my heartbeat align with the rhythm of water and the subtle shifts of muscle on stone. I think of all the nights I once lay awake, chased by the memory of a sinking car, certain the river would only ever be a place of loss for me. Now, when I picture this stretch of water, I see a pillar, a ledge, and a wild family who taught me that vigilance can be an act of love, not just fear. When the last light drains from the sky, I rise with care, joints protesting, and step inside. I leave the porch door cracked, just enough to let the night sounds filter through. The soft rush of the current, a distant train, the almost imperceptible shuffle of paws repositioning on stone. Behind me, the house feels less like a retreat and more like one piece of a larger, living whole. Before I sleep, I pause at the kitchen window and rest my fingertips on the driftwood and stone. Outside, the shapes on the pillar blur into darkness, but their presence hums along the edges of my awareness. We have become, in our own unlikely way, a kind of shared rescue team river, woman, wild mother, grown offspring, each guarding something fragile and necessary. I turn off the light, trusting that when tomorrow's 8 o'clock comes, the river will still murmur past the supports. The ledge will still stand above any surprise surge, and some small, spotted figure will be out there, watching, and I, on my worn porch chair with a familiar blanket over my knees, will be watching too, grateful, at last, that our lives found each other along this restless, stubborn piece of water. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.